Hi, Tommy Heffernan, veterinary consultant here. Welcome back to Tech in 10. I'm in my home office today doing this Tech in 10 this week. And because we get a lot of questions about rumen function at this time of year, cows and issues in spring grass, I'm going to cover a little bit on this Tech in 10 on what the rumen is and what it does and why this time of year the microorganisms of the rumen come under a little bit of pressure. So we're not really feeding the cow or the sheep or the ruminant animal. We're feeding the microorganisms in the rumen that are then producing substances, volatile fatty acids, that become the energy for the cow. The rumen, made up of the reticulum, omasum, and abomasum, is this microbial fermentation vat. And it's really important to understand. It sits on the left-hand side of the cow. It's about 150, maybe even bigger capacity, volume. And per mil, there's 10 to 100 billion microbes per mil. Not even conceivable numbers. More microbes than there is stars in the Milky Way. And if we think about that, we're feeding the microbes that are feeding the cows through fermentation. Because ultimately, we think about grass this time of year, this large fermentation vessel, the grass is going in and the microorganisms in there are working on grass to produce a number of volatile fatty acids, which make up about 60 to 80% of the energy for the cow. And there's a couple of ones. Acetate, which is the main volatile fatty acid, makes up about 60% of the volatile fatty acids produced, is a very interesting one because it directly is involved in the production of milk fat. So when we think about milk fat percentages on our bulk tank or our milk recordings, that's a really interesting indicator for acetate. And we do see acetate where we have a more fibrous diet going into the cow being high. So when we see milk fat drops at herd level, it can be an indicative of acetate and rumen function. Then we've propionate, where we see more with sugars and starches, and propionate is a precursor for glucose, so the cow doesn't digest glucose. The propionate goes to liver to produce glucose, and we know how important glucose is for immune function and as an energy source. And then finally, the butyrate, so that's about propionate 20-25%, and butyrate is about 10 to 15%. The butyrate is a really interesting, and I've done a lot of research and reading about butyrate. That's involved in the cellular function of the cells of the rumen, the epithelial lining, the transelectrical resistance. So from a rumen health perspective at a cellular digestive level, butyrate is really important. And the proportions of these can change over time, particularly as we head into spring, but it's really important to understand that it's the fermentation of the hemicellulose and cellulose that's converting by the work of these microbes into different volatile fatty acids, which then feeds the cow, produces the milk, and contributes to everything else. So we think about the microbes in the rumen of the cow. There's about 200 species, and there's kind of 4 key ones we look at. There's the fibre digesters. They're very sensitive to pH. They're the kind of natural ruminant microbes, ruminococcus. There's other species there. And these fibre digesters break down cellulose and hemicellulose plant material into primarily acetate, volatile fatty acids. Then you have the microbes that work on sugars and starches, typically streptococcus. And these water-soluble carbohydrate digesters are really important. They're in lower numbers. When we come into springtime, they're kind of important. We think about early calving cows as well. We think about how important they are early on. Then you have the protozoa, which act like a kind of almost police service for microbes, monitoring and controlling microbial populations and aiding with digestion as well. And then you fungi would act in the gut and the rumen, should I say, for breaking down. They typically produce rhizoids which break down plant material that bacteria maybe can't break down on their own. So this ecosystem, these 4 main types of microorganisms in the rumen work together synergistically and are very balanced. They're sensitive to pH, and what we feed goes into the fermentation vat of the rumen. So why do we see a little bit more issues at springtime? Spring gas is absolute rocket fuel. The dry matter percentage, we see this increase of water-soluble carbohydrates, sucrose, fructose, and glucose in spring grass. We also see higher crude protein, which leads to nitrogen and ammonia, which ultimately we can measure with milk urea, which the ammonia is broken down to urea in the liver. And that's it. Milk urea is a kind of a crude measure of protein digestion. If it's going up very high, we mightn't be having, because we have so much protein going in there, often the crude protein is too high for the rumen to work with. Fibre is low, so effective neutral detergent fibre, effective fibre is a little bit lower in spring grass. We have higher concentrations of oil, conjugated linoleic acids, And obviously, because we've lower fibre, we've lower saliva production. So saliva is the buffer for the rumen. The cow can produce up to about 200 litres of saliva a day through rumination. So saliva is a very important buffer. When we have less fibre production, we can actually see, fibre in the rumen, we can see a reduction in saliva production. The other thing as well is that the rumen, the whole musculature rumen, is controlled by the vagus nerve, so we can actually hear rumination occurring in those waves of rumination. So when fibre is an important part of trigger for that as well. So spin grass faces these challenges. So on some farms, what the risk is we can get this subacute ruminal acidosis, which means that the pH drops down, certainly below 5.5, but 5.8. We get a shift in the microbial populations. We get less fibre digesters. We typically get more of these sugar and starch digesters going up. And we get the rapid fermentation of these water-soluble carbohydrates. So the microbial, the acidity of the rumen changes, and this can create challenges. So what can we do? I suppose when we look at rumen health, we can look at milk fat percentages, we can look at the cows themselves. What's really interesting with the monitoring systems, and I love looking at this data, so we've been doing work with cows on rumen health for 3 years on farms. You'll see some of our YouTube videos with the likes of Michael Going and others. We've been looking at researching the rumen and the cow, and it's been really interesting how we can impact rumination, what that impact that has on milk fat percentages. Very interestingly, is the reduction of lameness. Again, this is hard to quantify. It's work we're doing, even on fertility, because ultimately, when you get the cascade of a lowering of pH and rumen health, or lowering of ruminal pH and the rapid fermentation of water-soluble carbohydrates, you get a lot of gram-negative bacteria populations exploding in the rumen. You get the production of LPS, lipopolysaccharides, which cause inflammation and have a negative impact. And this is where we see issues with lameness, fertility, mastitis. And being, I suppose, the rumen being so important to overall health, it can have these knock-on impacts, and we're continuously monitoring rumen health. One of our outcomes is we will have a new product coming to support rumen health, acute rumen health issues in the coming months, and that's very, very exciting. We've been doing a lot of work on that, and it's a very effective product. So, but just to recap, rumen health is kind of key in springtime. Rumen is this massive microbial fermentation vat. We're not feeding the cow, we're feeding the microbes. Think about that fermentation production. When we see shifts in the microbial populations in the gut, true shifts at springtime, we see the differences in volatile fatty acid. It does have a negative impact on cows. We need to monitor it, and particularly where you have monitoring systems, looking at rumen data over time, along with your milk fat percentages, can give you indications on rumen health function on your farm. Okay, look after the rumen microbes, and they will look after the cow. The cow will look after you. See you next week for Tech and 10 again.